excited about this. I was afraid it was going to be late because I didn't get on board until 5, so by the time I got down here.
And really, the traffic was brutal, wasn't it?
And the road construction doesn't help.
Yeah. You need this.
Yeah.
Just sit. Because the hip, oh, my hip was great.
I'm back on Tuesday.
That's no offense, that's just how I see it.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Hello. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm Deputy Director of the Kansas City Public Library, and we're thrilled to have you here tonight for our program. Before I get started, I did want to say a really wonderful, warm thank you to our partners tonight. So please help me thank the Women's Equality Coalition, the United Nations Association of Kansas City, the American Association of University Women, Stand Up KC, and League of Women Voters. We could not do this program without our partners, so thank you. Well, I wanted to alert you to one quick event, and an important event coming up at the Central Library downtown on October 12th. We're celebrating the second annual Heartland Book Festival, back again for the second year. This partnership with the Missouri Humanities and the United States Library of Congress Center for the Book is going to be incredible. Headlining speakers include Stacey Abrams, Michael Threets, Deborah Taffa, and Tommy Orange, just as a start. To find out more information, please check out our website at kclibrary.com, and we'd love to have you there. There's tons of events the whole day downtown at Central Library. We are also happy to have our viewers at home and elsewhere joining us on the library YouTube this evening. So if you have any questions and you're at home, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them after the program. And if anybody has any questions here tonight, we would love to have you come down after the program to the microphones, and just please ask your question in the microphone so that everybody can hear it. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce an accomplished young leader in our community, Taylor Flemons. Taylor is a third-year law student at UMKC, where she is also pursuing her MBA as part of a dual enrollment program. She currently serves as the president of the Black Law Students Association, demonstrating her dedication to fostering diversity and inclusion within the legal field. Tonight, Taylor will be introducing our esteemed speaker, Claudia Nachega, Deputy Executive Director of the Young Feminist Party. Claudia will discuss the state of feminism in America and around the world, as well as her organization's efforts to finalize the Equal Rights Amendment and advance gender equality. So please help me welcome Taylor.
Good evening, everyone. I would first like to thank the Kansas City Public Library for allowing us to use this space, and Women's Equality Coalition for allowing us to partner with this event. It is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for tonight's event. Our speaker, Claudia Nachega, is a force to be reckoned with the fight for equality. At just 19 years old, Claudia is already leading a youth-led feminist movement as the Deputy Executive Director in Youth Feminist Party. Her work is centered on recruiting, training, and mobilizing young people across the nation to advance feminist policies and ensure that the voices of the next generation are heard loud and proud. Claudia's passion for justice is rooted in her belief that ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, will significantly advance the rights of women and people across the gender spectrum. Her advocacy goes beyond the ERA, encompassing reproductive justice, expanding protections to queer and transgender individuals, and promoting economic justice for all. In addition to her activism, Claudia is deeply involved in legal research. She works as a research assistant at Columbia Law's ERA project, where she focuses on critical issues related to anti-queer and transgender legislation, reproductive justice, and legal theory. All of this while pursuing a political science degree at Barnard College, Columbia University. Claudia's work has already been recognized and highlighted in numerous major media outlets, including Reuters, Forbes, Elle, and Miss Magazine, just to name a few. Please join me in welcoming the inspired young leader and powerful voice for equality, Claudia Nachega.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today, and I want to extend a special thank you to the Women's Equality Coalition for inviting me and to the Kansas City Library for hosting me today. And I'm so excited to share so much about the Equal Rights Amendment and the rise of the Young Feminist Party with you all. So with that, I will just hop straight into it. The Equal Rights Amendment was crafted by Alice Paul in 1923. Its goal was to enshrine gender equality deeply within American constitutional law. The amendment's language is clear. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's 24 words. It seeks to create a legal landscape where the distinctions between men and women in crucial areas like divorce, property, and employment are completely dissolved. A 21st century ERA that espouses substantive equality underlies the spirit and goals of the modern ERA movement. The ERA, rooted in a substantive equality interpretation, achieves true sex equality through today's intersectional lens of gender justice in ways that prior Supreme Court precedents under the 14th Amendment and in an outdated 19th century framework and privacy rights fall short.
We're here today because we believe it is time that Congress affirms the Equal Rights Amendment as the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. And we are organizing Congress by launching this caucus to make sure that equality becomes enshrined in the supreme law of our land.
For so long, we have either been erased or relegated to a footnote in history. And so I hope this representation, this demonstration here today of a truly multiracial, multi-generational coalition affirms that there will be no erasure any longer.
The Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, is a U.S. constitutional amendment that guarantees equal protections under the law to people of all genders and sexual orientations. The ERA caucus that Representatives Bush and Presley introduced will be the first of its kind.
This movement to pass the Equal Rights Amendment is one that is being led by and centering women and people of color who were originally excluded from the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. And so this caucus allows us a vehicle to affirm that the fight to pass the ERA is alive and well. It is relevant, it is necessary, and it is timely, especially in this moment when we continue to see so many legislated attacks against the rights of women and our LGBTQ siblings.
There are many direct ways that the ERA will improve the lives of women and people of other genders in this country. So we think about education inequality. When Congress passed Title IX in 1972, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program or anyone receiving federal assistance We know that despite significant progress for women, women of color have not benefited equally from the gains from Title IX. We know Black girls have a school suspension rate of 12% compared to 2% suspension rate for white girls. This is how we will make that change. When we look at gender wage gap, the ERA could be used as an anchor to pass better laws that are focused on enforcement of wage gap provisions. We can talk about healthcare. Sex-based discrimination prevents many from accessing healthcare in the United States. So with the ERA, Congress could set benchmarks for increases in healthcare insurance coverage for women of color. And we cannot forget reproductive freedom. The ERA will protect our basic right to abortion care. And those are just a few of the things.
The ERA was first introduced in Congress in 1923. Over its 100-year history, the amendment has been the subject of many legal battles. Though it's reached the 38-state threshold required for ratification, the ERA has been halted by a congressional deadline set in the 1970s. Representatives Bush and Presley are introducing legislation to overcome this barrier.
The women of this country have done our work, states have done their work, and now Congress must do its work and do away with this arbitrary deadline.
I hear from opponents of the ERA that we don't need the ERA because we already have laws in place to protect us. And so I have to ask, who is that? Who is us? Because I need those protections. My daughter needs those protections. My community members, my constituents need these protections. What's already in place, it doesn't fully protect. And so because of that, give us our rights and give it now.
My daughter, who's been with me at many rallies and things, says, why you always say when we fight, we win? And I said, because it's true. And so that's why I'm going to continue to take on this ERA fight with Representative Bush and others in this multi-generational, multiracial coalition, because I'm not going to be a liar to my kid. When we fight, we win. And I believe we will.
So, the Equal Rights Amendment was first unveiled by Alice Paul in 1923. There's only 2 requirements in the United States Constitution for a constitutional amendment to become a constitutional amendment. The first one being the amendment has to pass by 2/3 of Congress, which the ERA fulfilled. It passed out of Congress in 1972, and it has to be sent to the states and be ratified by 3/4 of those states in order to become an amendment. Now, even though the ERA passed Congress in 1972, it was sent to the states, although it was slow to become ratified. And eventually what happened was many feminist activists on the ground rallied behind Congress, urging them to extend the deadline on its ratification that Congress decided to place. Now, this deadline was extended by 7 years, and in 1982, the Equal Rights Amendment did not meet its deadline for ratification. Article 5 doesn't talk about deadlines. It only mentions 2 things. In 2017, former Nevada State Senator Pat Spearman decided that she wanted to get the Equal Rights Amendment done. She introduced the necessary legislation in Nevada's state legislature in order for Nevada to become one of the last 3 states needed for the Equal Rights Amendment to come into the Constitution. In 2019, Illinois followed. And in 2020, Virginia became the 38th and final state to fulfill the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, many organizers and activists and leaders like myself have argued that for all intents and purposes, the Equal Rights Amendment is the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, of course, there is pushback because of this arbitrary deadline that Congress imposed on it. What's interesting to note about this deadline is that the deadline wasn't included in the text of the amendment itself. Congress and the states vote on the text of the amendment itself, whereas this deadline was included in the preamble of the resolution of the amendment when it was introduced in Congress. These are some of the biggest disputes regarding the legal status of the ERA and whether or not it actually should be in the Constitution. Now, apart from that, there have also been several states that have attempted to rescind their ratifications of the Equal Rights Amendment. And while some people may use that in debate and argument, for the most part, the focus of the pushback on the ERA has been around the question of its deadline. The Equal Rights Amendment today is being pioneered by young people. We're talking about feminist issues like abortion. We're talking about attacks on LGBTQ youth, whether that's book bans or denying gender-affirming care that is absolutely life-saving, and sexual and gender violence, especially when it relates to failing Title IX protections. The Young Feminist Party was born out of the Virginia state effort in order for Virginia to become the 38th state to ratify. Young people were not going to let arbitrary deadlines get in the way of their equality. And because we affirmed the ERA as the 28th Amendment, what's next? Now, some scholars have argued that because it's been ratified, it has to be certified. Now, certification historically has been just a formality in terms of actually getting amendments into the Constitution. And now it has become the heart of this legal battle to win the Equal Rights Amendment. Certification and publication of the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution is essentially left up to the executive branch. So the states have done their part, Congress has done their part. Now it's up to the head of the executive branch, the president, to instruct the National Archivist under his authority to certify and publish the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. Now, of course, this hasn't happened yet, and many enemies of the Equal Rights Amendment, of course, have made these battles in court. However, attorneys general of Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, the last three states that ratified past the deadline, brought forth a lawsuit essentially stating that the National Archivist, David Ferriero at the time, was shirking his duty in not publishing and certifying the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. Now, attorneys general from Virginia and Nevada ended up dropping out of the case. Now, this made it all the way up to a high court of appeals in the United States, and essentially it was thrown out. So what's interesting to note is that this can't be seen as a loss for the Equal Rights Amendment. The court didn't say that, oh no, the Equal Rights Amendment failed, the deadline is moot, all of this stuff. And a lot of people like to argue that. The case failed on another arbitrary procedural matter that doesn't actually reflect any substance of the debate around whether or not the Equal Rights Amendment should be published into the Constitution. So essentially, what we should take away from that is it's up to Congress. Now, I did say that the Equal Rights Amendment can simply be certified and published by the President of the United States at this moment. There are other folks that also say, if Congress had the power to place a deadline on the Equal Rights Amendment, Congress has the power to remove that deadline. So we have two paths forward to finalizing the Equal Rights Amendment: certification and publication under the executive, deadline removal from Congress. And there's a lot of legislation right now that's being pushed forwards by new ERA leaders. And these are leaders that the Young Feminist Party has been collaborating with in order to get it across the finish line. I want to talk a little bit about the Young Feminist Party and our backgrounds. and what we're all about. So the Young Feminist Party was founded in 2019. Like I mentioned previously, we were born out of the ratification effort for Virginia to become the 38th state to ratify. And since then, we have grown a 14,000 strong youth-led movement fighting to finalize the Equal Rights Amendment. And we do this in several ways. We do direct action, we do civil disobedience, rallies, marches, and more. We do judicial and legislative advocacy. In the Ferriero case that I mentioned to you regarding the ERA's ratification and the National Archivist, we were able to submit an amicus brief highlighting why young people want the ERA in the Constitution. We also do legislative advocacy. We rally our members of Congress, we go up to Capitol Hill, and we make noise. We go into these meetings, we talk about why this matters to us as young people, because we know that we have the most to gain from an Equal Rights Amendment 1 and the most to lose from an Equal Rights Amendment delayed. And beyond that, we also organized at the electoral level. Essentially what this looks like is plugging into feminist issue-based campaigns, trying to rally more young people in support of different issues that are on the ballot that pertain to young people. For example, right now there are several states in the United States that have abortion ballot measures that seek to codify the constitutional right to abortion at the state level. Now, this is going on in New York State with its New York State ERA, in Florida, in Arizona and Nevada, and of course, Missouri. And essentially what we've sought to do in these states is reach out to the ballot measure campaigns and build out formal youth wings of these campaigns to energize, organize, and mobilize young people to get out the vote for abortion. And beyond that, we make sure that we retain them in our network so that they can continue to take action with the Young Feminist Party to organize around feminist issues in their area, but with the ultimate goal of winning the federal Equal Rights Amendment. I got into organizing for the Equal Rights Amendment when I was in high school. So I was 16 or 17 years old, and Texas state legislature had just passed its heartbeat bill, Senate Bill 8, which severely restricted abortion access. Now, this was a sham bill. This was before the Dobbs decision came out. Nonetheless, young people, especially where I'm from in Maryland and the DC area, all came out to the Supreme Court essentially stating that the right to abortion is our fundamental and ought to be our constitutional right. And we made noise, and we marched up to Mitch McConnell's house, and we made some more noise there. It was very interesting. But that was my first taste of what direct action looks like in Washington, D.C. And beyond that, we did so much more. We did marches with different feminist groups in the area. Of course, we did lobby days. We also slept outside of the Department of Justice overnight in freezing cold weather, demanding that the National Archivist do his job and certify and publish the Equal Rights Amendment. This is what we're about. We are young, scrappy, and hungry. Now, a lot of what has been said about the ERA usually pertains to its legal status and whether or not it is the 28th Amendment and whether, all of these things regarding the deadline and rescissions, et cetera, et cetera. And don't get me wrong, the ERA is the 28th Amendment for all intents and purposes, but it's also important to take a look at the movement side of things. How are we building the political power with young people in this country in order to actually advance our gender equality? Because the Equal Rights Amendment is about our futures and our lives. When we think about the issues that we care about the most, and probably the most popular one today, abortion, we know that the Equal Rights Amendment has the power to restore the constitutional right to abortion that we lost with the Dobbs decision. Now, the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. The Dobbs decision essentially said that the Constitution doesn't talk about abortion. It didn't say that the Constitution dislikes abortion. It certainly didn't say it likes abortion. It just said the Constitution has no matter in terms of, at the federal level, whether or not abortion is federally protected. And that's awful, and that's devastating. And I remember in high school, when the Dobbs decision was leaked, there was outrage. Even at my conservative Catholic all-girls school in DC, which Justice Brett Kavanaugh also happens to be a community member of. And we went to DC, we went to the Supreme Court, and we rallied, and we rallied, and we rallied, and we rallied. Now, Roe v. Wade and subsequent Supreme Court decisions after it regarding abortion have historically been based on the privacy rationale under the Fourth Amendment. But we know that the privacy rationale is not enough to sustain this constitutional right to abortion, which we have obviously just lost. And that's where the Equal Rights Amendment comes into play. We know that abortion and whether or not people have access to abortion has everything to do with sex, and we know that bans and restrictions on abortion is sex discrimination. And we know that the ERA is a viable tool towards restoring that constitutional right to abortion if it's published into the Constitution. And we don't just have to theorize about whether or not the Equal Rights Amendment could actually do this, it's already been done. Now, states have their own constitutions, and state-level equal rights amendments, and states, even conservative states like Utah, Iowa, Pennsylvania, have all successfully struck down bans and restrictions on abortion in those states. The ERA can restore the constitutional right to abortion. It's already proven it. And when we talk with other young people in different movements, this is something that energizes us. It gets us excited to fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, of course, some of you may know, especially if you're of an older generation, especially during the 70s feminist ERA movement, where the ERA movement was all the talk. Obviously, you recognize today that it's not very mainstream and not many people talk about it. And why is that? Well, I have a few theories. One being, the 70s feminist ERA movement was bold. It was energetic. It's inspiring. And at the face of that movement was typically a white, middle-aged, middle-class woman. And ERA activists in the 70s were so passionate about getting this across the finish line that little by little, they started chipping away at things that the ERA could actually protect. They started taking certain things out of their messaging. They started talking a little less about queer and trans people, and they talked more about equal pay for equal work. They started talking less about abortion, and they started talking more about employment benefits. They took out so much of what is essential to our sex equality and so much of what truly resonates with young people today. And that essentially created a schism within the feminist movement. You have your ERA movement, you have your reproductive justice movement. And even though I believe in some ways they should be one and the same, there are not. Even today, when we think about big leaders in the reproductive justice movement, we think about reproductive freedom for all, formerly known as NARAL. We think about Planned Parenthood. We don't usually think about the National Organization for Women as much, even though that was all of the hype in the 70s. The National Organization for Women is amazing. It's still kicking, and I love the people there. But of course, it's sad to see that these movements don't interact with each other as much because Mistakes have been made in the past that has made it difficult to mend those relationships. Now, this is where young people come into play. I believe that there is a generational gap between the people that fought for the ERA in the 70s and Gen Z today, and then the rest of the generations in between that don't seem to really talk about the ERA. Now, the Young Feminist Party is doing its work with these more established feminist organizations that in the past have championed the ERA, and we've created an intergenerational, multiracial movement that centers those who have the most to gain and the most to lose, namely Black and brown women, queer and trans folk, people of color, low-income folk. Now, the reason why we do this isn't simply for the sake of inclusivity. We do this because it's a strategy. We put them at the forefront of this movement as leaders because these are the folks that obviously have the most to gain. But when we have minor setbacks, when we have losses in this movement, these are going to be the folks that are going to be the least satisfied with minimal gains and the most energized to win it because it directly affects and impacts their lives. The work that the Young Feminist Party is doing is crucial, and it does it in coalition with other Gen Z organizations. Now, Gen Z is known for a lot of different things, especially our fighting spirit when it comes to protest and organizing. And some of the biggest Gen Z organizations and protest movements you think of have a lot to do with climate justice. We think about groups like Sunrise Movement. On the left and more labor-leaning groups, we might think of Democratic Socialists of America. We think of other Gen Z groups that are primarily based on the digital scene, like Gen Z for Change or Voters of Tomorrow, and so many more groups. Now, why is this important? These Gen Z organizations, movement organizations, have established themselves as a political force. For example, when President Biden was elected into office, he passed some of the most historic, sweeping climate legislation to ever be done under the President of the United States. That didn't come out of nowhere. That came from young organizers on the ground who day in and day out continue to do the kind of work and continue to put the kind of pressure on elected officials and Biden's presidential administration in order to make that happen. Like I said, the ERA isn't mainstream. Not a lot of people know about the Young Feminist Party, but if you ask a young person, they probably know about Sunrise Movement. So it's important that, naturally, we work together. We share resources. We uplift each other's work on social media. We show these other feminist organizations like Planned Parenthood and Reproductive Freedom for All that the young people of this country and its partners and its allies who've done so much more in different movements are coming to them with a demand and an ask, that they start championing the Equal Rights Amendment in whatever advocacy that they're doing. Because we know that typically when a person runs for office and they want to get the support of women's groups, they go straight to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is great, they do amazing work. But unfortunately, they don't seem to care much about the Equal Rights Amendment. And I know this because this is the kind of hurdle that I've had to encounter in my personal work with the Young Feminist Party, and it's been frustrating. But the best way to get them to pay attention to it is if they see that the young people are watching and that the young people are organizing. And when it comes to elected officials, they have to see that their young constituents are making noise about it. The number one goal of an elected official is to get re-elected. So they are going to run on whatever their constituents care about the most, amongst other things. But if people in their district, if people in their states aren't talking about it, they quite frankly don't have to care about it. That's just the reality of the matter. If we don't get the ERA out there as a household name, they're not going to talk about it. I can't tell you how many lobby meetings I've been to with elected offices, especially on the Democratic side of things, who say, we support the ERA, we'll support the legislation that supports the ERA in Congress. They're like, we need to get that done. We need to ratify that. It's been ratified. It was ratified in 2020. It's a frustrating thing to hear because that's the whole point of the argument and the legal debate today, that it has been ratified. A lot of electeds and political leaders see the ERA as this vague amendment that is supposed to support women, but they haven't quite realized the legal power that it has. It's not just theoretical. Like I've said, it's already proven itself at the state level, with state level ERAs. So that's why folks in the Young Feminist Party continue to organize. And we continue to organize with new political leaders in Congress who are championing the ERA, most notably Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman Cori Bush on the House side of things, and Senators Ben Cardin and Senator Kristen Gillibrand. Now, especially on the House side of things, we have new faces in Congress. It's not a coincidence that the leaders, the congressional leaders of the modern ERA movement are Black women, or women of color. They reflect the diverse demographic of the young people's movement for the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, I've talked to you guys about the Equal Rights Amendment and the legal debate behind it and a little bit behind the Young Feminist Party and coalition building, but how realistically do we actually win the Equal Rights Amendment? Now, this is some legislation in Congress right now that seeks to get the Equal Rights Amendment across the finish line. So I mentioned earlier that there are two pathways to finalizing the Equal Rights Amendment. There's removing the deadline on its ratification that was imposed by Congress, and then there's also just getting the President of the United States to certify and publish. These are not competing strategies, although it may seem like that at first glance. Now, with the work that I've been doing with the Young Feminist Party, we've connected with these offices in Congress to pursue two similar but different resolutions. One resolution, all about deadline removal. Another resolution that basically says we as Congress affirm the ERA's the 28th Amendment because it's been ratified, because it's already been passed by Congress. And that resolution that affirms the ERA's the 28th Amendment calls upon the President to take immediate action and certify and publish it into the Constitution. Now, right now, obviously, we have divided government. The House is red, and the Senate is blue. So it's very difficult to get anything passed, as you can imagine. But a common question that's often come up is, how are you actually going to get that ERA legislation passed if you have the Senate filibuster? This Senate filibuster requires much more votes than the simple 51 majority in order to actually get certain legislation passed. And it's an interesting question, and it's one that I love to answer. Because the Equal Rights Amendment is Article 5 legislation, important constitutional matter, Congress can't use an undemocratic tool like the filibuster to block it. Now, how do you make that argument? How do you actually remove the filibuster, at least for the Equal Rights Amendment? Well, that's all up to the Senate Rules Committee. And the Senate Rules Committee can deliberate and decide whether or not it actually wants to do this. And even though these members on the Senate Rules Committee say they support the Equal Rights Amendment, they don't always do what they need to do in order to actually get it across the finish line. However, it is important to know that right now, we don't really know what's going to happen in November. Now, I have a pretty good feeling about it. But there's so much that we don't know yet. But that's why we have to continue taking action. That's why we have to continue putting pressure on our electeds in order to get this legislation across the finish line. That's why we organize in districts with competitive races in order to secure and elect people into office that we know that are going to champion the ERA, so that we can get those majorities we need in Congress to actually get the ERA across the finish line. And also at the executive level saying, hey, so-and-so president, you say that you want to restore the constitutional right to abortion. You want to codify Roe, restore Roe. How many of you guys have heard that? Yes. How? Yeah, they haven't said either. I don't really know what they're planning on doing, but the Young Feminist Party and I have an idea, and it's to get the ERA published into the Constitution. Now, of course, we're going to continue putting pressure on our elected officials and candidates in order to make this happen. And of course, apart from movement leaders and movement organizers, of course, there are leaders in Congress and other leaders across the country that are coming together in order to also put pressure on other electeds and the executive branch in order to actually get this across the finish line. So a little while ago, the first ever Congressional ERA caucus was launched by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Congressman Cori Bush. It is the 5th largest caucus in Congress, and they've come out with a mission that they're going to recognize the ERA as the 28th Amendment, and that they're going to do everything that they can in their power in order to get it across the finish line. These are small steps, but these are good steps. I witnessed the first launch of the Congressional ERA caucus when I was in high school. I often feel like I am making history. And it feels good. It feels really good to be a part of that. I really enjoy the work that I do as an organizer. And a lot of the things that are able to motivate me are people like you. People that in your time, especially when the 70s feminist ERA movement was kicking, did everything you could in your power to get it across the finish line. This is an intergenerational movement. The ERA did not die in 1982. It's just been a little dormant. But now, young people are taking up the mantle. We're passing the torch, so they say. And we're going to continue to fight to make sure that the decades-long work that has been put into this, from 1923 all the way to 2024, isn't all for naught. It's been 101 years since the ERA was first unveiled, and still we do not have constitutional sex equality. But in order to make that happen, we have to support the movements working day in and day out to make it happen. And this is where I'm going to plug the Young Feminist Party. We have a website where you can learn more about us. If you are more tuned into social media, we also have an amazing Instagram page where you can follow us at Young Feminist Party. You can also follow me. But also, whatever way you can to support us, whether that's with expertise or monetarily or in any other way, we can help us fuel our movement at
youngfeministparty.org/donate. And if you are a young person or a member of Gen Z, you can scan this QR code if you'd like to become an organizer with the Young Feminist Party today. So that'll be all for my official presentation, but I'm really looking forward to hearing you guys ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia and Nachega. And if anyone has a question, please come up to one of these microphones so that our audience at home can hear what you have to say. And we can also take questions from the audience at home, which I'll be monitoring my phone for.
I have multiple questions, and I'll try to stick to just one.
Okay.
You say the movement is multi-generational. I want to know, is it multi-gender, and what percentages of genders do you have within the within the whole movement to get the ERA recognized?
In the Young People's Feminist Movement. Now, I don't have those numbers right at the top of my head, but what I can say is that a few weeks ago, last month in July, the Young Feminist Party hosted its first ever national convention, and it was awesome. I saw people there from all different walks of life, different races, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, but of course we know that the ERA and the fight for sex equality isn't just between men and women. Young people are fighting for an ERA that centers racial justice, that protects queer and trans people and those that identify beyond the gender binary. We know that on the basis of sex, those words alone prohibit discrimination against women, but also against trans people, against queer people. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about same-sex couples, for example, no one has an issue with Jane and John being in a relationship, although if Jane was Henry, then there would be an issue. That's a form of sex discrimination. When it comes to people that identify beyond the gender binary, we don't really have a problem with that happening unless they start to dress or act like they're, quote unquote, not their assigned sex or not their assigned gender. That is a form of sex discrimination. I got asked the other day from the producer of the still working 9 to 5 film, are there men in your movement? And I was like, well, theoretically, yes. Theoretically. And I said, of course, there are. I work on an amazing national team with a few young folks, and we are an amazing team. And there are 2 guys on our team. There are also 2 queer men. Have I met a straight white man in our movement? Probably, I don't happen to recall, but we are a very diverse movement, I will say that. It's not just about women, it's about queer people, it's about trans people, and so much more.
And since the young people are coming up alive, I guess, have you thought about doing any partnerships with, like, I know David Hoag's group, I think his is the Leaders You Deserve, you get.
Yes.
Yeah, so have you done anything, like a guy?
Yes, okay. David Hoag is an amazing individual. David Hoag was one of the founders of March for Our Lives. That is the organization that was born out of the Parkland shooting in Florida that took the lives, sadly, of too many young people too early. We work with the gun violence prevention movement. We've worked with leaders like David Hoag and David Hoag, of course, in order to organize, in order to uplift our work. And now David Hoag has gone on to found Leaders We Deserve, which is a PAC. So it is a little different from the work that the Young Feminist Party does. But of course, we know each other, and especially in our personal capacities as individual leaders and movements, we always seek to support each other.
We have a question from someone watching at home. Cori Bush lost her primary to represent Missouri in Congress. How will this affect the math to get the ERA codified?
So that was a very devastating loss for the modern ERA movement, I will say. Now, it doesn't affect the math too much. That race, her seat is most likely going to go blue. In terms of the actual numbers that we need to get in Congress, Missouri's first district, St. Louis, is solid. Like, I don't see how her primary challenger wouldn't support the ERA, and if he didn't, the Young Feminist Party would have something to say about it. But in terms of progressive Gen Z organizations right now that are engaging in electoral organizing, a lot of the races that they're looking at are competitive races in California, in New York, and a few other states in order to actually secure a House majority that we know will vote in our favor for ERA legislation.
Thank you.
Is there any way that the ERA addresses the unique struggles that Native Americans face in America today?
Yes. Like I said, we're pushing for a substantive equality interpretation of the Equal Rights Amendment. That's a little different, it's actually very different, from what the Supreme Court has historically used in terms of looking at cases of discrimination against certain groups and individuals. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment just to give some background to this. But some people ask me, why do we need an ERA when we have the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment obviously doesn't explicitly prohibit sex discrimination because it does not say sex. But also, it's more than just explicitly having sex written in the Constitution in order to trigger a higher level of judicial scrutiny, strict scrutiny, which is the highest level of review that a court can give when regarding cases of sex discrimination. And right now, suspect classes like race, religion, national origin under the 14th Amendment enjoy that privilege from the Supreme Court, which means that it's very different in terms of getting justice for discrimination on the basis of those categories versus on the basis of sex. Now, some people have argued that fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment should be a fight for having strict scrutiny review for cases of sex discrimination. That's the highest level of review. That is it. That is the gold standard. Now, folks at the Young Feminist Party, on the other hand, would appreciate strict scrutiny, but we're also not totally bought into strict scrutiny. And that's why we're also taking a look at the kinds of the philosophy that the Supreme Court is actually using to interpret certain amendments. Now, the thing about the ERA is we wouldn't gain what we have from the ERA if sex was simply included in the 14th Amendment. And that's because the Supreme Court has historically used formal equality jurisprudence in order to take a look at cases of discrimination. Now, formal equality jurisprudence traditionally can be used to help members of marginalized groups, especially when we think about the 14th Amendment and the context in which it was ratified. We think about slavery and we think about discrimination against African Americans. But we've also seen that some folks on the Supreme Court have used this kind of jurisprudence to say that the 14th Amendment, the Constitution, is colorblind, that race doesn't exist, and that if we just say it, no racism. Now, obviously that doesn't make any sense. And that's what's really problematic about that jurisprudence. We saw with the Students for Fair Admissions case with Harvard that affirmative action was actually struck down under the 14th Amendment, even though common sense might dictate otherwise, because we know that the 14th Amendment and its history and context has always been used and was ratified in order to support African Americans. And we know that striking down affirmative action doesn't support African Americans. Now that's where substantive equality jurisprudence comes into play. It doesn't say that the Constitution is colorblind, and it's not going to say that the Constitution is sex blind either. It's going to take a look at the different disparities that men and women and people beyond the binary face, but not just that, but also the different disparities that exist between Black and brown women and Asian women and Native and Indigenous women and all of those other folks that fit into the bucket of not cis white man. And that's really interesting. And it's something that takes a lot more care and work in terms of movement messaging. So when we talk about how we win the ERA, and we talk about what it actually means for women and queer and trans people across the country, we're talking about an ERA, obviously, that centers racial justice. And that's important because, especially when you have a Supreme Court like we do, these Supreme Court justices that we know aren't very friendly to the women and queer people of this country. Take a look at, they use an originalist lens, some use a textualist lens, but they essentially say, what did the ratifiers intend for this amendment to protect when it was ratified? And the ERA was ratified in 2020. So we're saying, well, we wanted to protect Native and Indigenous women. We wanted to protect queer people. We wanted to protect trans people. We wanted to protect Black and brown women. We recognize that the struggle for gender justice isn't one that just hinges on sex alone, but that individuals hold overlapping identities that give birth to unique experiences and injustices that a formal equality jurisprudence can't tackle. So we are fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. More specifically, we're fighting for a substantive equality interpretation of the Equal Rights Amendment. And I hope that answers your question.
I think that's it. Thank you very much, Claudia and Nachega, and thank you all for being here tonight.